Okay, so welcome to the Black Arts info session. This is a new program offered by the Toronto Arts Council, TAC, to support Black artists, arts collectives, as well as Black-led arts organizations receive some dedicated funding. And so we're going to be going over the different requirements, eligibility requirements, a little bit about the application process, and just sharing generally about the program to support you in your application, and also answer any questions that you have before deciding whether this program is right for you. So before we start, just want to do some housekeeping. Welcome again to this session. You'll notice that this is a webinar session. So right now you won't be able to see yourself on the screen, and that's because we are recording the session. So we want to respect everyone's privacy in terms of folks that are joining us today. However, there will be an opportunity at the end to turn your mic on to speak or to turn your camera on if you would like to during the Q&A component. The Q&A component will not be recorded. So at that point, we will be turning off the recording so that you can sort of ask your questions freely, and that part won't go anywhere. So first, I'll be presenting, and then we'll follow that up with a Q&A. Of course, questions are welcome. Feel free to use the chat to dialogue. Feel free to use the Q&A to ask a question. All of those are at the bottom of your screen. You'll see them at the bottom of your screen. There is a chat box, Q&A, and you can also turn on closed captioning. We'll be providing some digital resources after this discussion. Things like frequently asked questions and the program guidelines will be shared with you via email after this conversation. If you do want to ask a question during the Q&A component, you can raise your hand. There should be a raise hand icon, and your mic can also be turned on if you would like to speak. So before we start talking about the program, I want to share a land acknowledgement. As we gather today, we want to acknowledge the diversity of the First Peoples of this area and recognize the territories of the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island and around the world, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work, to live, and to meet on this territory. So if you're familiar with Toronto Arts Council, then you know that we have lots of different types of programs within the Toronto Arts Council. But to share a little bit about our vision, Toronto Arts Council is an arm's length funder for the city of Toronto. And we are really interested in arts making as city building. So the idea is to support artists across Toronto, especially sort of in geographical areas of the city that are underrepresented in funding, to really be able to kind of animate our city through the arts and support artists and arts communities that do that. So just for a little bit of a background, if you're new to TAC, TAC again is an arm's length funder, and we offer grants programs funded by the city to a broad cross-section of different arts organizations, individual professional artists, as well as artist collectives. So there are two main granting categories within TAC. There are discipline-specific grants that fund specific disciplines, and there are strategic initiatives programs, which are specialized programs for particular impact. So things like Arts in the Parks or Animating Toronto Parks programs, and innovation programs such as Open Doors. So I won't be going over different programs that we offer, because today is more focused on the Black Arts program. But if you do have questions, I encourage you to visit our website, reach out to program managers that manage those programs, and you can find out more information that way. So the Black Arts program, which is situated within the discipline-specific granting category, we essentially are a new program, and it's just been launched in July, so of this year. And this program supports Black arts communities, including individual artists, collectives, and arts organizations. The program is in response to systemic barriers that Black artists face in accessing funding. And we're really seeking to look at how we can not just to respond to those barriers, but create supports that can provide more long-term sustainable solutions for underfunded or arts organizations, to Black artists, and just generally look at closing some of those gaps that exist within Black arts communities. So in creating this program, we did consult with Black artists and arts workers to find ways that we can respond to those needs. First, we did a consultation session where we explored what it is that individual Black artists, as well as arts organizations, would want to see from a program like this. We had lots of conversations with about 179 Black artists and arts workers. And what came out of that is this report, which you can find on our website. And the report is Black Arts Funding for a Black Arts Future. And these are recommendations for Toronto Arts Council. So this report really kind of gives you an overview of what this program, what it took to create this program, the different recommendations that we incorporated into the program design. And essentially what happened after these conversations is that we implemented certain changes. For example, the granting amount changed because Black artists and arts workers felt that there should be more funding available. So we did implement that recommendation, went from $300,000 to $500,000 for the first year. And again, we're hoping that this program will grow so that we can offer more as the program continues. Since this is a recurring program, we wanted to use this as sort of a beginning phase of really just kind of understanding what the needs are and responding to them. But this program is open to change and just to stay attentive to needs as they change within the community as well. So once the program was designed, we did a second round of consultations to co-design with the community. So what that looked like is we again sat down with Black artists and arts workers. We sent out surveys to really get some feedback on what the design was looking like. And from that, we were able to finalize a design in collaboration and consultation with Black artists. So that's a little bit of a background. And I think that it's really important for you to know this about the program because this program was created with a lot of thought and intention, but this program is not a static program. So we're hoping to, as we offer it each year, that it'll continue to develop and improve. So if you do have feedback, you're welcome to give your feedback as well. So who is this program for? Black artists, individual artists would need to identify as Black, of course, but I want to focus a little bit on how to define Blackness within a collective or arts organizations. So to be eligible for this funding as a collective or a nonprofit arts organization, you would need to be Black-led, Black-focused, and Black-serving. So we call this sort of the B3, or that's actually a term that was, I believe, created by the city. And so I'm going to refer to this as B3. And essentially Black-led it means that the majority of your leadership at all leadership levels are Black. So that includes your founders, if you have an advisory board or board of directors or some sort of a governing body, then they would need to be majority Black. You would also need to be Black focused, which means the primary goal of your organization is to meaningfully support and engage Black communities. And Black serving, which would mean that a significant portion of your program activities prioritize serving Black communities. So I'm going to address that Black serving does not necessarily mean that your organization needs to only serve Black artists or Black communities, but it does need to be a primary focus within your mandate. So you can have programming for that's open to other communities, but just keep in mind that to be eligible for this particular program, that in terms of annual operating, for example, you would need to really kind of have dedicated programming that also supports the development of Black artists or that employs Black artists, for example. Okay, so the Black Arts program, I'm going to go over the different program components in more detail, but just to give you an overview, there are two main components. There's the projects and there's the annual operating. Projects, of course, is project-based funding, and it's one-time funding. Annual operating is core funding, and this is annual, so organizations would need to apply each year. However, the core funding goal is really to provide more sustainable funding. So projects involves creation and development, so that's one category. This is open to individuals and collectives, but not open to incorporated organizations, nonprofit organizations. And then presentation, which is open to all, to individuals, collectives, and organizations. Annual operating is, again, core funding, and it's open to arts organizations and collectives. And if you're wondering about this image, it's by an artist named Iko Namiko, and he is a Lego artist and graciously agreed to be a part of our promotion campaign for this program. So I really love this image. I want to share that with you. I may have mispronounced his name, so apologies if I did. But so this you'll see a lot on our website and on our different promotions for the program. And again, this program is now open and available for applicants. So if you would like to apply to this program, or if you would like to visit our website, torontoartscouncil.org, you'll see it listed there. Okay, so this program, again, funds essentially it funds projects. So I'm going to go over the two different components for projects in a little bit more detail. And feel free if you have some questions, because this is kind of where we are getting a little bit more detailed in terms of each program component and what's offered and who's eligible. Feel free to ask questions. You can, kind of ahead of time pose your questions in the Q&A and they'll be addressed later, or you can throw them in the chat as well. Okay, so creation and development supports full creation, partial creation, or completion of a work in progress. And this is open to any arts-based discipline, any arts discipline. It's also open to any project in any stage of completion. So I'll explain this a little bit more. If you wanted to apply to this program and you had an idea to create a project, let's say you're doing a theater project, and you wanted to get funding for, anything related to the program, and the entire project, let's say, from playwriting or research and development to playwriting to hiring your artists to creating or releasing the play, doing outreach, etc., and all the way until the end of the project. You can apply for a creation and development grant for this entire project. But if you just wanted to, let's say, fund the research and development component, you can also still apply to the creation and development granting component. If you wanted to only fund the playwriting component and a little bit of some of the further stages, then you could still apply for that. The reason why this is so open-ended is because Black artists mentioned that that's a need. So a need is one of the needs that were addressed was the need to be able to have sort of flexibility within how much of the program, the project component, is being funded, so that if there's a project that was in progress and that artist is not able to complete that project because they ran out of funding, then we will fund the rest of the project if that project is successful. So the idea here is really to open this up so that you can get your project funded at multiple stages, or you can get a full project funded as well. So it is open to individual artists and collectives and arts organizations. Sorry, it's not open to arts organizations. That's a typo. It's only open to individual artists and artist collectives. The maximum grant amount is $10,000. However, there is a mentorship component within the project granting component. So a mentorship it could be a one-to-one mentorship or a group mentorship. And that would be a separate part of the application, but still within the project's application. So what happens is when you're selecting which project's component you're applying to, you can have the option to select a mentorship component, and that opens up the maximum to $15,000, because mentorship component is up to $5,000. So there's some additional funding to be able to fund a mentorship within your project grant if you would like that. Same with presentation. Mentorship component is included, and it's the same amount, $5,000. So I want to talk a little bit about presentation. Presentation supports exhibition and dissemination of work by Black artists in any arts discipline. So this is open to individual artists, artist collectives, and arts organizations with existing work to share. Now, if you wanted to present some work and you still have a little bit of creation and development to do within that work, that's okay. An exception can be made in cases like that. So, but presentation, if you're applying for presentation, the main thing to keep in mind is that your primary activities would need to be presentation based. Okay, so it doesn't mean that if you, again, like that example of a play, if most of the work is done and you just have a little bit of left to do in terms of creation, that's fine. You would just need to, it doesn't have to be a fully completed work, but it would just be that the granting within your budget, most of the project activities are presentation oriented. And that's what the main difference is between, presentation and creation and development. So just keep that in mind in terms of how you're deciding the grant component that you'd like to apply to. So there are some additional supports for the project's component. And this is really exciting because this is the first time that we've offered these different supports within TAC programs. The reasons why we're offering the support and these resources is so that, again, the project grant recipients can have some additional professional development resources, something that was identified as a need to close some of those barriers or address some of those barriers. And I'll go over the different components one by one. So I already mentioned mentorship, which is embedded within the application. Mentorship could be a variety of different models. So there is you can apply for one-to-one, or you can apply for group mentorship. It really is, as long as you can provide a rationale for the mentorship that you're requesting. We really don't look at the kind of model of mentorship that you're using, and whether it's peer mentorship or any of the other ones that I mentioned. So again, this is an option within the application, and it's not a guarantee that you'll receive a mentorship if you do receive a creation and development or presentation grant, but it is another part of your application that can be assessed. Another component that we're adding as an additional support is arts career development workshops. So we've received additional funding within this program for arts career development workshops and some of the other supports as well. So this would be drop-in workshops focused on growing and establishing your art practice. And these workshops will be determined once applications are assessed, and we will send out a survey to get an idea of what applicants are interested in terms of the types of workshops we create and offer. So that's something, again, that we recognize it might be a need for artists that are completing their projects that may want some additional supports with, let's say, marketing, or developing different skills, administrative skills, and that kind of thing. So that'll be available. And then the last support available is Black Future Studio Co-Creation Lab. And essentially, this is a networking space. We hope to be able to offer this in 2022, pending, COVID public health guidelines on open, physical spaces. But essentially, this is a space created, it's a multidisciplinary space that will be created to support artists to meet each other, collaborate, and exchange ideas. It'll be, we're partnering with arts organization to offer this space. And the space will have multiple different studio spaces that you can access, arts making materials that you can access. And we really wanted to create this space to, again, support professional development, to also allow artists to be able to collaborate and to meet each other. So these are the three supports available to project grant recipients. And if you have any questions about them, again, feel free to ask your questions and I'll address them later. So I want to talk a little bit about annual operating program and what this program funds. So this is core funding, as I mentioned earlier, and it's available to nonprofit Black arts organizations. You do need to be a Black arts organization to qualify for this. And this funding program is intended to develop, support organizations in their development to, continue to flourish within Toronto's arts landscape. So that was an overview of the two different programs. So we're going to get into eligibility now, and I'll share the different eligibility requirements for each program. But first, I want to talk about just generally what would make you eligible for a Black Arts program within TAC. So, so in terms of projects, it would be projects by arts organizations or collectives that are Black-led, Black-serving, and Black-focused. Projects by individual artists who are Black are taking place, projects that are taking place in Toronto. So you do need to have a Toronto address to apply and it would need to involve applicants that reside in Toronto. So if you are an artist collective, and an artist collective is defined as two or more artists, doesn't have to be incorporated. It doesn't really have to be a formal group. It could be informal. Just two artists working together or more. Please keep in mind that 51% of your group would need to have a Toronto address, which means if there are two artists in the collective, both of you would need to be from Toronto. If there are three artists in the collective, at least two of you would need to be from Toronto, and so on and so forth. So most of the group needs to have a Toronto address. And in terms of the parameters that we cover in the city, if you have a postal code that starts with M, that would make you eligible in terms of having a Toronto address. And the projects also support any arts discipline, including multi and interdisciplinary arts. Okay, so projects, just going over this again, but it would need to be professional Black artists and collectives. The way that we define professional is an artist who has a history of public works. It could be, one, it doesn't need to be a particular amount. And of course, all levels of practice are welcome. So whether you're just starting or you're seasoned, it's really open to anyone who has sort of a public history of being an artist in the city. Projects that pay artists. So you would need to be mindful of making sure that you're paying artists fairly within your project. If it is a project where you're involving other artists, taking into consideration fees like, Carfax fees, or fees from other regulatory bodies that are suggested as equitable fees. Please take things like that into consideration. You can also ask artists in your project before you submit your application what their fee is. And then that way, you have a confirmed fee that you can add in your budget. But that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind, is making sure that, you're paying artists a fair fee. And that's something that the panel will take into consideration as well. So I mentioned work in progress or experimental projects are eligible for projects grants. In terms of annual operating, nonprofit arts organizations, this can be a collective as well, but there are a few other eligibility criteria to keep in mind if you are a collective. So you would need to be active for 2 non-consecutive years. And what this means is that you would need to have had sustained activity in the past as an arts organization, but it doesn't have to be consecutive. So it does have to be recent, which is, again, a little bit open-ended. So there's some flexibility there. But this is really just to make sure that the organizations that are applying do have a history of creating programming within the city, and they don't have to necessarily have applied for project grants, but they do need to have a history of sustained arts activity. And then, of course, I mentioned B3, so be Black-led, Black-serving, and Black-focused. You would need to have a board of directors or a steering committee or some other sort of governing body within your organization, aside from your regular staff and founders and that kind of thing. And you would need to have a viable administrative structure and financial records. And this is something that, again, will be taken into consideration by the panel that will be assessing those applications. Is what does the administrative structure look like, and what the financial health of the organization is. And there are opportunities to explain any deficits your organization may have incurred, any challenges your organization may have had in terms of administrative viability or structure. So there is some, again, opportunities for just special consideration, but you would need to mention that in your application. And if you have any challenges or concerns with your organization's history, please just speak to me as program manager, and I'm happy to kind of share, how to address those things and some steps that you might want to take. Okay, so in general, TAC grants, again, I mentioned that we don't fund if you're outside of the Toronto area. The project will need to have been completed, projects that are already completed before the announcement results are not eligible. So this means, we don't fund retroactively. So keep that in mind. If you are applying, your project start date would need to be 4 months out from the deadline. And the deadline is October 7th. So we also don't fund businesses or entrepreneurial commercial activities. So we don't provide startup funding for entrepreneurs or businesses. So if you are a for-profit organization or collective, then you would not be eligible. And lastly, we don't fund undergraduate students or projects that are part of an academic assignment. Well, not lastly, actually, there's more. Okay, so projects that are not primarily focused on the arts are not eligible. And there are more details in the guidelines, by the way, if you'd like to have a look at why some of these activities may not be eligible. And costs related to equipment purchases, capital projects. So we don't fund capital expenses, things like, leasing and building purchase and things like that, fundraising activities, etc. Mentions here, and I think it's worth mentioning that it says that we don't fund projects that are publishing and archival projects. However, you'll notice in creation and development, we do fund research and development. And if part of your process in the research and development has to do with archival as a project activity, that's okay. It just can't be an archiving project. So that's the difference there. Okay, so the application. Want to go over different types of applicants and some of the things to just consider based on what applicant type you are. So if you are an individual, there are tax implications. So please keep that in mind as you're, applying as an individual. We of course expect you to pay yourself as an artist. So that's a very important fee to include. But also just keep in mind that, it's important to keep track of all of your expenses and receipts and invoices that you may incur for projects that involve other expenses other than paying yourself a fee. And if you are an individual, you cannot apply for operating funding. If you're applying as an organization, this would include, registered charities, incorporated nonprofits, unincorporated grassroots nonprofits, collectives, etc. That's sort of the definition of what we define as an organization or an arts organization that's eligible. You wouldn't be able to apply to creation and development if you're an incorporated nonprofit, but you can apply as a collective. And of course, as I mentioned, it must be a B3 organization. So another thing that's really different with this application process and this program as a whole is that there are multiple formats that you can select for applying to for your application. So you can submit answers in written. You can also submit answers via audio submission or video submission. And this was created within the application to allow for accessibility for those who may feel more comfortable with audio or video as they're answering their questions. There are some exemptions, however, to the various different formats. And some of these include things like the budget, work plan, your general profile or ID page as an applicant. Anytime you have to upload a list with things like bios or the activity lists for your organization, questions about our equity implementation, and I mentioned list again, that includes things like project contributors. And the reason why these different components don't have multiple formats is because it's a lot easier for the assessors to be able to assess this written, because it involves multiple different, fields that work better may work better within a chart or may work better within a fillable table. So you'll see various options there. So that's one thing that to keep in mind as you're going through the application is that certain questions, most of the questions, will have the option, and you can select a different format for different questions as well. So if you prefer to write one of your questions, you can do that. If you prefer to speak one of your questions in audio, you can do that. So those are the different formats available. So with your application type, if you're applying for creation and development, keep in mind that your project needs to be primarily based on creation, so creating an art project, or on research and development or testing a project idea. So you can apply if your project is an arts education-based project as well, like a series of workshops. Creation and development would be an ideal place to apply if you want to create a workshop series or you want to facilitate a workshop series. And creation and development is ideal if you want to fund a particular phase or stage of your project. In terms of a presentation grant, it's ideal to apply to a presentation grant if your project is primarily focused on presentation. Again, it may have other components that feel a little bit more like development or creation, but the primary focus needs to be on presenting the work. And also if you have existing work that you'd like to present or disseminate, or your project is a showcase or exhibition. So these are the ideal sort of categories for each situation. So when to apply for an operating grant, you can only apply for annual operating, again, if you're a nonprofit arts organization, if your organization has regular programming that serves Black artists. If your programming is seasonal, you may still be eligible, but you will have to let us know and explain your production cycle a little bit more. So there's an opportunity to explain that within the application. And there are some more details in the guideline about how to go about explaining this to the panel. Your organization has to have a strong equity focus. So a strong focus on diversity and inclusion. You can read about our equity implementation and our equity framework, and I'll send you that details about what that looks like as well. And this is really important. If you are applying for annual operating, you will need to meet with me to go over your eligibility. This is a mandatory requirement. There are some questions that we need to kind of go over for every operating organization. So if you're applying for annual operating and you haven't yet gotten in touch, I'll leave my contact information at the end of the session, and you can get in touch with me directly to talk about your application. So what's new in this program? I mentioned there are a lot of different changes happening with the Black Arts program, specifically related to some of those recommendations that we receive from Black artists and arts workers. So I want to show you some of the things that you'll notice are a little different about this program. And a little bit of this is a review, but I think it's important to mention. So new application formats. The word counts are a little bit shorter for most questions, and the questions are condensed, so there are not as many questions. A lot of these changes were for the sake of accessibility and to reduce some of the administrative burden on applicants. You also can apply to another discipline-specific project grant in this category. So if you're applying for Black Arts project and you also want to apply to a music creation grant, that's possible. With other projects programs, usually we restrict to one grant in a category per calendar year, but this one's a little bit more open, again, to allow for more opportunity. And so overall, you would be eligible for a total of 3 grants per year instead of 2 grants per year. So that's different in this program. And then, of course, the phases. You can apply for a work in progress or partial completion. The mentorship is also something that's new, built in within the application. So in terms of annual operating, some of the things that have changed, again, there are multiple different formats, written, audio, and video for this operating program as well. Again, shorter word counts, condensed questions. Organizations can also apply to the stream without having received previous project grants. For our other operating programs, you need to have received 2 previous project grants. For this one, you can apply without that. And we've also lowered the reporting threshold for new annual operating clients, and everyone will be new because this is our first year. But essentially, in your first year, you don't have to do any CADAC reporting. So if those of you who are representing arts organizations will be familiar with CADAC. It's a financial reporting system for organizations receiving arts funding. So you will not need to do CADC reporting. You can if you'd like to, but it's optional. And you also, as an annual operating client in your first year, you do not need to submit audited financial statements. We do require unaudited financial statements. And in your second year is when you would need to do the CADC reporting and audited financial statements. So again, this is to reduce the administrative burden on onboarding annual operating clients. Okay, so organizations don't need to have consecutive years of sustained activity. You do need to have some sort of sustained activity of 2 years, but it doesn't have to be consecutive, which is again different from some of our other operating programs. And the reason for this was also considerations around COVID, knowing that there may have been challenges in terms of being able to sustain certain programming activities and organizational activities in the last couple of years. And then this one is also really important to consider if your request amount is under 20,000 or if your approval amount is under 20,000. If that's the case, then you can apply to one discipline-specific project in a grant category within discipline-specific, and then you can also apply to a project grant within strategic initiatives. So for those who are receiving core funding that's under $20,000, you can get 2 other project grants to sort of, or you can apply for and be eligible for 2 other project grants to look at kind of supporting your programming and then potentially use the core funding to support the operational pieces. So you'd be eligible for a total of 3 grants per year instead of 2 grants per year. So accessibility and the assessment process. We'll talk a little bit about the accessibility grants that we offer, and then I'm going to share how we assess our grants. So we have accessibility grants available for projects that involve deaf, mad, and disabled artists. So you are eligible to apply to additional funding of up to $5,000 for accessibility costs. And again, this is for artists, so their costs incurred during the project. And this could relate to things like ASL interpretation, audio description, closed captioning, attendant care, and communication assistance. Not limited to these things, but these are a couple of examples of how you could use this funding. So this option is actually available in your application. There's a component or a tab you'll see that shows accessibility grant. It's of course optional to fill it out, but if you do require this support, please consider filling that out. So this is another accessibility support that's different from the grant. So there's the accessibility grant, which is $5,000. And then there's a grant that you can apply to as an applicant, and you can get $500 per year to cover the costs that you might need to actually fill out the application. So one is to support artists in your project, the first one I shared, and this one is to support you if you are an applicant who's deaf, mad, and disabled, and you need support to complete your grant application. So this cost can go towards support service providers that can support you in filling out your application if that is a barrier for you. So the assessment process is similar to assessment process for our other granting programs. There will be a panel of practicing artists and representatives from partner organizations. The panelists will be Black artists and arts workers, and they're going to be selected based on the applicants in terms of the types of arts disciplines that we're seeing from applicants and different arts practices. So we actually determine panelists after we've received the application. to be able to have a panel that is representative of the types of arts disciplines and other considerations that we see in the projects that are submitted. So the panels are composed to ensure fair representation of gender and cultural diversity. And there is assessment criteria. So the panel will score the grant, and then there's an adjudication process where we sit down and we have discussions about the applications to make final decisions. And some of the things that panelists are looking for is artistic merit, meaning the quality, artistic quality. So looking at the project's description, the project being proposed. They'll also review support material to look at the artist's history and the type of work that the artist has done in the past. The panel will also look at the applicant's capability in terms of what they've demonstrated in their application to carry out the project as outlined. Financial viability of the project, including making sure that there is adequate payment for artist fees. And then other criteria that might be, that you'll see within the application. So, things like the work plan, making sure the work plan and the budget are aligned with each other. Things like that are also really important to the assessment process. So when you're writing your grant, please read the guidelines really carefully. This is a really good start to understanding what should go in your application and how to approach the application, but the guidelines have a lot more detail. So looking at, is your project a good fit for this program? What are the deadlines? I can tell you right now, the first deadline is October 7th, but there's a little bit more detail about upcoming deadlines and the general timeline and structure of the program as a whole. So that's really important to look at. For example, the projects program after October 7th will actually be a rolling deadline. So you can apply throughout the year, throughout the calendar year for 2022. Another important thing is to contact program manager to make sure you're eligible. Or if you have any questions regarding your application or your project idea, I'm always available to support you with any of those questions. You can send me an email. I'll also link a booking appointments system that I have set up on Calendly, where you can book an appointment directly with me and we can have a conversation about your grant. As a program manager, my job is to support you to make sure that your application is, that you're clear about the guidelines and your application is as strong as it can be. Of course, we don't offer grant writing support, but we will guide you in terms of the questions. If you're headed in the right direction with your answer, for example, these are some of the things that you can ask me about and I'll help to kind of guide you in the right direction. Of course, eligibility is also one of those things that you'll want to check before even starting the application. You can get some feedback from me on your idea and that kind of thing as well. So that's really important. It's optional for projects, but it's mandatory for annual operating. So keep that in mind. Giving yourself time. This can't be stated enough. We're about almost a month out from the first deadline. So this is a really good time to start to gather your materials, to confirm your mentors if you're applying for mentorship, to look at gathering things like bios and CVs and support material that you'd like to share within your application. So this is it's really important to take your time because some of the questions do require you to look at getting materials ready ahead of time. So this also, of course, gives you an opportunity if you start early to be able to have time for me to potentially look at some of your answers and let you know if you're headed in the right direction. And then also it'll give you time to get your application edited by someone else, a second pair of eyes on your application, which we always recommend. Use clear and direct language. So make sure that you're telling your story in a way that anyone, even someone outside of your arts discipline, can understand what you're talking about. So try to avoid using like really language and jargon that's really specific to your industry or your arts discipline. And this is important for any grant, but especially for the Black Arts grant, because the panel will be a diverse panel of hopefully mostly multidisciplinary artists, but there may be a few panelists that are not as familiar with your art practice because there are so many other arts disciplines that we're looking at. So make sure that you're as clear as possible and you really give the panel a very clear picture of what you want to do with your project, or if you're annual operating, how your what your organization's impact and story is, and how you hope to use the funding. I already mentioned getting feedback, so that's really important. And then, of course, triple checking, completing all of the fields, making sure that things are all lined up. Your project description aligns with your work plan, which aligns with your budget, and so on and so forth. So those are some tips. If you would like to meet with me one-on-one, again, I mentioned that it's mandatory if you're annual operating, but highly recommended if you're applying for projects as well. I do have office hours set up. I'm going to send a link shortly of where you can apply, or sorry, not apply, but sign up for office hours to ask questions or get a walkthrough of the application. And this is mostly via phone, but if you would like a Zoom session, we can do that as well. Okay, so feel free to, again, connect. There's my email, my phone number, our website. You can take a picture of this, or I can also link this in the chat for you. And that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for attending the session, and I hope that was really useful for you. Stick around because we're going to be doing a Q&A after this.